Here's a question that always starts arguments. Is the original Legend of Zelda still one of the best games in the series? Most people will tell you that's the wrong question. They'll say that you can't compare it to later entries because they came out in different eras, with different hardware, different expectations. You have to judge each game by when it came out. And on the surface, that makes sense. But I think that argument sidesteps what people actually want to know, which is how do these games stack up when you actually sit down and play them today? Rewind 40 years and forget everything that came after, and you're looking at an incredible game. It was ambitious, it offered more freedom than almost anything else at the time, and rewarded curiosity in ways most games simply didn't. But about 5 years later, A Link to the Past took that same foundation and pushed it forward with tighter controls, smoother pacing, more mechanics laid on top of each other, stronger sense of progression, and more to engage with from minute to minute. Then came Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, Breath of the Wild, each one building on what came before. Yet some people still argue the original belongs at the top, that it beats out not just later 2D entries, but even the 3D games that refined its formula. So when we look back at the 1986 original, the question isn't whether it was important, because that part is settled. The question is whether it genuinely holds up as one of the best when you place it next to everything that followed. And while I'm using Zelda as an example, this goes for all games, what I'm talking about in this video. Using a game's age as a shield doesn't really work when you're talking about how enjoyable these games actually are to play today, and that's really what I want to focus on. I don't want to dismiss these older games, and I'm not arguing that newer ones are automatically better. I like plenty of older games more than entries in the same series, but I want to have an honest conversation about what happens when you compare games across eras without letting For Its Time end the discussion before it starts. And look, to be clear, there's no objectively correct answer here. If you genuinely enjoy the original Zelda more than any game that came after it, you're not wrong. If you think Breath of the Wild is the best, you're not necessarily right. Preference is personal. When it comes to ranking games for yourself, what matters most is how much you enjoyed them. But here's what I am arguing. Refinement does matter. Taking a good idea and making it smoother, clearer, and more responsive is real work that produces real value. Later games building on earlier ones is just how design evolves. And I need to emphasize this, some old games are genuinely better than their modern counterparts, even when you judge them by today's standards. Super Mario World still holds up not because we're being generous, but because it plays incredibly well right now. The controls are tight and responsive, the level design is expertly crafted, the difficulty curve teaches you naturally. You could release that game today with updated graphics and it would still be one of the best platformers available. So that's not nostalgia, it's great game design that hasn't aged. The question is why some old games feel timeless and others feel dated. When we're having broader conversations about how games hold up, we need to be able to compare experiences honestly. When you compare games from different eras, the hardest part isn't deciding which one you like more, it's deciding which one you're actually comparing. Games can be important, influential, nostalgic, and meaningful all at the same time, but those things don't always line up with how a game actually feels today. Most arguments start when those ideas get lumped together and treated as if they're the same thing. The foundation of any comparison has to be what the game is asking you to do over and over. Moving through the world, fighting enemies, solving problems, navigating menus. These actions define the experience far more than a reputation. If they feel responsive and intentional, and the game pulls you in, that's one thing, but if the controls feel stiff, slow, or awkward, it's gonna start to wear on you. Controls are the foundation of everything else, because if movement feels unresponsive, if attacks don't come out when you press the button, if jumping feels floaty and imprecise, nothing else matters. You can't forgive bad controls no matter how clever the design is. Super Mario Bros. 3 is an NES game and it still feels great. The original Zelda, for example, feels rougher because the movement is more rigid, and it just doesn't feel as smooth to play. Hardware limitations can explain this, but it doesn't change the experience of playing them now. And yeah, some of you are thinking, that's not fair, they were limited by hardware. But think about what that actually means. When we say A Link to the Past controls better than the original Zelda, we're not criticizing the 1986 developers, we're acknowledging that technology enabled better controls. And I don't think that should be controversial. The NES controller was simply better than the NES controller, the hardware was better, and later games took advantage of that, recognizing that progress doesn't disrespect the original. And here's the thing, sometimes we are part of the problem. Our hands expect different things now. We expect instant response when we press a button, we expect to be able to cancel out of animations, we expect frame perfect hit detection. These aren't unreasonable expectations today, and that's because of decades of technological advancements and control refinements. When we go back to games without these things, the difference can become a lot more immediate. And this isn't to say that all these old games control poorly. In fact, some of them still hold up today, even the ones that aren't perfect. It's just a product of its time for an older game to feel a little clunkier than today. Communication is another major factor. A hard game can still feel fair if it makes its rules legible and gives consistent feedback. When something goes wrong, do you understand why? When you fail, does the game teach you something, or does it just feel unfair? And this is also where things get interesting, because vague doesn't automatically mean bad. Super Metroid is one of my favorite games ever, and it's absolutely vague at points. Most Metroidvanias are. The game barely tells you anything, you're expected to explore, experiment, and figure things out on your own. But when you get stuck in Super Metroid, it's usually because you haven't found the right path yet. not because the game failed to communicate its rules. The controls are tight, the movement is fluid, the world is designed so exploration feels rewarding instead of punishing. Compare that to the original Metroid, which has similar ideas, but executes them a lot rougher. The game expects you to map everything yourself because the developers assumed you either draw your own maps or just have a map separate, and that was normal in 1986. You'd also spawn in with 30 health every time and use a password, which meant you spend the first few minutes of every session farming health before you really actually play. The environments are also repetitive to the point where sections blend together. Movement feels slow and limited also, so we're touching on all the points I went over. Both games are vague, but when the core mechanics feel good and the world gives subtle guidance, that mystery enhances the experience. When movement is just slow and when all rooms look identical, it just becomes more guesswork, which you may disagree with me, but I just don't see as very fun. And before I end this topic, we can look at something like Zelda 1 compared to Dark Souls. Both games are cryptic and both expect you to figure things out, but Dark Souls is cryptic about lore and secrets while being clear about mechanics. Everything in the game feels good. When you die, it's on you. Doesn't feel unfair, and the game kind of nudges you forward. Zelda 1 and a lot of other games at the time just don't do that. Anytime games from different eras get compared, someone will say you have to judge it by when it came out. And that instinct isn't necessarily wrong because context does matter. Understanding when a game was made explains why certain design choices exist. Limited memory, simple controllers, and unfamiliar audiences completely shaped these games. But here's the issue. Judging a game by its time is useful when you're talking about influence or historical importance, but what it doesn't tell you is how the game actually feels today when you play it. And in my opinion, that's the most important part of a game. Every game is shaped by its era, not just older ones. If we lock older games into their historical context but judge newer games only on how they play, that comparison just stops working, and you just end up with two completely different standards. And there is a double standard here to some extent. Older games get protected by their limitations, while newer games are expected to clear a higher bar automatically. And there's something else I want to expand on here, because design doesn't appear fully formed. It does change. Every Major Leap Forwarding game design starts messy. Someone builds the first version of something, whether it's a 3D camera, a targeting system, analog movement, open world structure. It's always going to be imperfect when it starts. The industry then spends years smoothing out that friction. The camera in Super Mario 64 is a perfect example. By modern standards, it's clunky, it gets stuck, it just doesn't feel good. But in 1996, the camera was revolutionary. No one had solved this yet in a 3D platformer. Every 3D game that came after learned from this. The reason modern cameras feel invisible is because developers spent decades reacting to the problems Mario 64 revealed. The same applies to lock-on targeting and Ocarina of Time. Z targeting was groundbreaking, but today it feels standard. And that's just the process when it comes to game design. Games improve by reacting to shortcomings. So when we go back and criticize those early attempts, we're judging prototypes against systems that have had 25, 30 years of iteration. And here's the key nuance here. It doesn't mean the flaws disappear. If someone released a game today with Mario 64's camera, or Ocarina's stiffness, or Half-Life's ladder physics, it would get torn apart. Not because those games were bad, but because the design language has evolved, and our expectations evolve with it. So applying modern standards blindly can distort history, and I did want to touch on this more because it doesn't feel right saying a game that has poor controls because of the time it came out makes it a bad game, but it may make it less fun compared to others. We can acknowledge this and say that the game still is good even if it's not the best today, but refusing to apply them doesn't do these games justice. And the reason I chose these two specific games is because I think even with the issues these games have, they still hold up incredibly well. Ocarina of Time is my favorite Zelda game. I do prefer the 3DS version, but even with the clunkiness of the original, even when I compare that to games that came after, I still think it's the better game. Same with Super Mario 64. It has far from the best controls. In fact, I think it's one of the biggest issues with the game, but even with that, when I put it side by side with games that come out now, I still find myself preferring that game design. Modern games don't just get praised for being smoother. Modern games don't get praised just for having quick travel, good controls, or being more readable, because that's the baseline for most games. It's because we have decades of progress and technological advancements. And there are times where for its time genuinely is the complete answer. If you have something like an experimental game, or a game that was revolutionary at its time, you can use that to argue that the game is an all-time great, even if it's not the greatest compared to games today. Take Pong, for example. If that game was made today, no one would care about it. It's one of the simplest games of all time, but for its time, it was extremely important and very fun. And I feel like that's just another argument people are making there. And before someone says, by your logic, old movies and books are bad too, no. We can appreciate Citizen Kane as groundbreaking while acknowledging that modern audiences might struggle a little bit with it. We can love Shakespeare while admitting the language is a barrier for some people, but I also don't think these are the best comparisons because gaming is also an interactive medium, which changes things. A slow-paced film with campy effects and poor camera quality is still watchable today. You're a passive observer. You can appreciate Citizen Kane's cinematography even if it isn't the same as what we see today. While people may enjoy it differently, we're all going to have the same basic experience watching it. A slow game with stiff controls actively fights against you for hours. Can't appreciate the dungeon design if you're struggling with basic movement, and if you give up halfway through, you don't get to experience the rest. So going back to the original Zelda today, it's easy to see why it left such a strong impression. It dropped into a world with very little guidance, a surprising amount of freedom, and the structure still feels very bold. But like I've went over a couple times in the video, the execution shows its age in ways that are just too hard to ignore for most people. There are still things to really love about it. The open-ended game design, the simple nature of it, which is a plus to a lot of people, it makes it a very fun game to speedrun. But is it wrong to say that the future games use this basic formula but just expanded on it a lot? Like with A Link to the Past, it took everything the original Zelda did and just did almost everything 10 times better. And I'm using 2 old games as examples here deliberately, because you don't need shiny graphics and modern menus to see this progression. I don't need to compare Tears of the Kingdom to the original Zelda to make this point. And some remakes and remasters really improve games that were good under the hood, but just needed modern quality of life touches to make it more comparable with the games of today. Look at Link's Awakening. I think it's still a fun game regardless, but the HD version just makes it so much more playable today. It just takes what the original did and fully expands the ideas that were in it to be a better game. But here's another part of the conversation I want to touch on a little more. There are some old games that generally just don't age, or at least very little. These aren't games that are good for the time, they're just good, and understanding why these games hold up is just as important as understanding why others don't. Let's go back to Super Mario World. That came out in 1990 or 1991 depending on where you are, and it's still better than most platformers that release today. Why? It doesn't have technically better graphics, it doesn't have a crazy amount of features, but let's start with the controls. Mario has exactly the momentum and air control you need, the power-ups here are fun, Yoshi's here, the levels test out a bunch of different ideas, and there's also just so much content here. There's no delay here, the game doesn't feel like a relic, it's genuinely just still a great game. If you take the original Super Mario Bros., which I still really do like, you can see how that game is aged. It still controls pretty well, but it's just very limited. There's only about 4 themes, 4 songs, a couple power-ups, and after a while, levels start to feel more similar. Super Mario Bros. Is obviously a much more important game than Super Mario World, but is it really a better one? But then a counter-argument could be that the levels are just generally fun here, they pose a good challenge, and to that I do agree. I like Super Mario Bros. Better than some modern 2D Mario games. I think Super Mario Bros. Is still held back by its hardware, and I do take that into account, but I could still like it better than something that isn't limited by its hardware. This is usually where the conversation stops being about design and starts being more about identity. A lot of people like older games because they grew up with them. Those games are tied to specific memories, specific places, specific versions of themselves. When someone criticizes how those games hold up, it can feel personal. Nostalgia is powerful because it doesn't preserve the full experience. It preserves the highlights. You remember the sense of discovery, the music, the feeling of finally beating something that felt impossible. What fades are the long walks back after dying, the moments of confusion, the parts where progress stalled. Super Paper Mario is one of my favorite games of all time, but would it be so high up for me if I played it now in my 20s compared to when I first played it as a 6-year-old? Probably not, but sometimes it also works the other way. I thought Super Mario 3D World was okay when I first played it, but years later I went back and realized there was way more going on than I ever noticed. Nostalgia can cut both ways. When you can't get back into something you loved, when the magic just isn't there anymore, that can sometimes show the game's age, but it can also show you things that you didn't notice about the game at the time. And I'm not saying it's impossible to enjoy some of these games now, or that you're only enjoying them because nostalgia. Do you think objectively, to-moment gameplay was more engaging and simply better than some games we compare them to today? Or are you just comparing it to other games at the time or your own personal experiences with it? Here's something else. We're probably worse at old games than people were back then. Kids in the 80s and 90s had way fewer games. They played the same handful of titles for potentially hundreds of hours. They memorized every screen, every enemy pattern, every hidden wall. When a game expected you to remember exactly where all the secrets were, you would learn. And we just don't do that anymore. Not only is there an infinite amount of games you could play without even leaving your house to buy a new one, but if you get stuck on something, it takes 2 seconds to find the answer. And I bring this up for a reason, because fundamentally it can change games. Games designed around repeated play sessions feel different when you're doing a one and done playthrough. And since games were limited at the time, you had to make do with what you had. It wasn't designed in the same way as something even like Ocarina of Time, which came out 12 years later. And before someone says I just want everything to be easy, no, I've beaten these games before, and some of them I really do enjoy. I'm not asking for games to be easier, and I think a reason I prefer a lot of more retro games is because of the difficulty. Doesn't mean all of them, but it's the reason I prefer something like Super Mario Bros. To a new Super Mario Bros. 2. However, in that game, I still think the difficulty is fair. When the difficulty comes from your own fault, it feels a lot different than poor controls or hitboxes that are screwing you over. Because one teaches you to improve and the other just completely tests your patience. So here's where I need to complicate my own argument a little bit. Sometimes modern quality of life features aren't solving problems, but they're more hiding bad design. Quest markers and waypoints can let developers be lazy with level design sometimes. Why make the environments guide the player when you can just slap an arrow on screen? Tutorial pop-ups can replace environmental storytelling. Why teach through play when you could pause the game and explain everything in text boxes? Look at something like Assassin's Creed. The worlds are massive, but they just feel lifeless. You're not navigating by landmarks or environmental cues, you're just following a waypoint on a map. Remove the UI and the game becomes nearly unplayable unplayable because the world itself doesn't guide you. Compare that to something like Dark Souls where you can turn off the HUD and still navigate because the world design itself tells you where to go. That's the difference between UI doing the work and design doing the work. And this isn't to say that a minimap or anything is bad, because some games absolutely need it, but I also feel like a good map design doesn't require you to constantly be looking at the map, if that makes sense. Old games were cryptic because they were smaller and denser, every screen mattered, every item had a purpose, every sequence was hand-placed with intention. The original Zelda's overworld fits on a single screen when you zoom out, and every tile here was deliberate. No, not necessarily, but there definitely is a lot of appeal here, and I feel like this is a good counter-argument. And it's not just quality of life features. Sometimes newer entries in a series generally are worse than earlier ones because they overcomplicate things without adding depth. Take the later Castlevania games. Dawn of Sorrow added a bunch of systems like crafting, multiple souls. Didn't make the game better, made it more complicated without adding any depth. Sometimes more features just mean more clutter. Symphony of the Night was just better for it. Or look at later Mega Man games that just added things that were not needed. More abilities don't automatically mean better design, because sometimes constraints force creativity. So when I talk about older games being hard to engage with, I'm not saying modern design is always better. Sometimes the friction in old games comes from an intentional, thoughtful design. Sometimes modern design smoothness is just covering up worse problems underneath. But again, going back to the central point, if it really does hold up, you should be able to compare it from games of any era and say, this is still really good and maybe even better. Because games of every generation have limits. Each generation as we go on just has less limits. But as time goes on, the limits mean a lot less. Take a look at the last generation. Sure, the PS4 isn't as powerful as a PS5, but the difference is in something like the NES to the SNES. Games simply don't have to evolve as much now, and that can be a knock on modern games. So how much do you value uniqueness and originality when comparing games of different eras? For me, I think it's important, but I also don't think we can use that to say a game is necessarily better. Some old games hold up brilliantly, some don't, some new games are improvements, some aren't. The only way to figure out which is to actually compare them. And look, there's a whole other conversation about high-level play where some old games shine brighter. Speedrunners find depth in old games that most players never see, but I'm talking about the average player experience here. And yeah, I might be nostalgia blind for whatever era I grew up with. I grew up with the Wii and the DS, and I look back at that era very fondly. I'm probably more forgiving of those games than I should be, but that's exactly my point. Nostalgia affects all of us, which is why we need to be able to compare games honestly instead of just defaulting to for its time. Here's something I'm not saying: that we're objectively better at evaluating games than people back then, or that our preferences matter more. I'm also not saying that every old game is outdated or that every new game is an improvement. What I'm saying is that when you sit down and play a game in 2026, you're bringing everything you've learned from every game you've played before. Modern control schemes, modern pacing, modern communication standards. These are simply just facts, whether you want them to be or not. Does this mean you shouldn't play old games? Absolutely not. It means you should go in with realistic expectations. Don't force yourself to finish something out of obligation. Don't feel bad if a classic doesn't click for you, and don't let anyone tell you that you're playing wrong if you use a guide or a ROM hacker, or just move on to something else. Your personal ranking should absolutely be based on what you enjoyed most, but when we're having a broader conversation about how games age and whether design has meaningfully progressed, for its time can't be where the discussion ends. I myself have gotten a lot of criticism for ranking some games comparatively. If I take the original Metroid and compare it to all the games that came after, I simply just didn't enjoy it much. I gave it a chance. I can appreciate what the game did. I don't think it's a bad game. It's just a very rough game for most people to play in 2026. Does this mean that it's going to be like that for everyone? No, but I'm comparing it to my other experiences. I'm not saying on its own when it came out it was great, because for me personally, I don't like to do rankings that way. I like to rank games based on how much I enjoy them, and I feel it would be disingenuous to rank a game that has aged pretty rough higher than games that I simply just had more fun with, that I think were better experiences. And that's my argument here. A lot of you are going to disagree, especially people who grow up during those times. A lot of them very passionately defend the games they played as kids and attack anyone who doesn't like it, not for quote unquote not being able to appreciate the games, or just hating old games, or saying new games are better automatically. And I don't think that's the case for most people. I think that's a straw man. And the truth is, none of this actually matters what I'm talking about. This is just my take on this, but the only thing that matters is your own ranking. What games do you appreciate if you're making a personal ranking? If you're making an objective ranking, that's when this may actually matter. But until then, if you want to defend an old game that a lot of people feel is aged poorly, defend the game itself. Don't defend it because of the time it came out. If you made it to the end of this video, it means you either like the video or you really hated my point in this so much that you want to try to counter everything I said. And if you do disagree and are willing to have a respectful conversation, let me know in the comments. This video is just my perspective and it's not meant to be the objective truth, so do let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you did enjoy.